To everyone here and to our friends on Skype. So before we begin tonight's talk, the society and values of the Egyptians, Druids and Druzes. Egypt, the land of alchemy, had their healer kings, the Druze, their holy Ukals, I think that's pronounced, linked to China's Egypt, linked to China's ancient brotherhood. The Druids had a sacred science that filled college cities with thousands of students, and as you probably guessed, you can see that on the maps that are available. Do our friends on Skype have a link to the map? I see that you
yes, we do.
Yeah, excellent, good. So just the usual drill, just to say a bit about the program. So it's tradition on the first of the month to read the declaration of the ULT, which is a commitment to unity, study and work. The policy of this lodge is independent devotion to the cause of theosophy, without professing attachment to any theosophical organization. It is loyal to the great founders of the theosophical movement, but does not concern itself with dissensions or differences of individual opinion. The work it has on hand and the end it keeps in view are too absorbing and too lofty to leave it the time or inclination to take part in side issues. That work and that end is the dissemination of the fundamental principles of the philosophy of theosophy and the exemplification in practice of those principles through a truer realization of the self in all capitals, and a profounder conviction of universal brotherhood. It holds that the unassailable basis for union among theosophists, wherever and however situated, is similarity of aim, purpose and teaching, and therefore has neither constitution, bylaws nor offices, the sole bond between its associates being that basis. And it aims to disseminate this idea among theosophists in the furtherance of unity. Excuse me. Thank you. It regards as theosophists all who are engaged in the true service of humanity, without distinction of race, creed, sex, condition, or organization. And it welcomes to its association all those who are in accord with its declared purposes and who desire to fit themselves by study and otherwise to be the better able to help and teach others. The true theosophist belongs to no cult or sect, yet belongs to each and all. And in the associate's card, which we have available at the back there, it reads, being in sympathy with the purposes of this lodge as set forth in its declaration, I hereby record my desire to be enrolled as an associate, it being understood that such association calls for no obligation on my part other than that which I myself determine. So, before we begin tonight's talk, we'll have a brief devotional reading from the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, I should say. So this is from chapter 18.
Notes.
Sorry, yes, and this is notes on the Bhagavad Gita. With the discerning power, there must also be the power of steadfastness. For unless we are constant in devotion to the higher life and the ideal of a conscious life in spirit, not matter, we will be recreant to the best we know. Having reached the power of discernment and having been shown the path which to us is peculiarly ours, we should set aside all other considerations that tend to draw us from it. We should cultivate and practice that power of steadfastness, holding the man together, which by devotion controls every motion of the mind, the breath, the senses, and the organs. This, as the chapter says, partaketh of the sattva quality. That is, the whole instrument is used for the best and highest purpose only. The power of steadfastness may exist without the highest power of discernment, as in the one who, looking for the fruits of action, cherishes duty, pleasure and wealth from the point of view of desire or rajas, or in the man of low capacity who stays fast in drowsiness, fear, grief, vanity and rashness, bound by the tamasic quality. If we have determined for ourselves the nature of action, the goal of true discernment and steadfastness, which is harmony of thought, will and feeling, as well as an action on the lines of our determination, we can only have done so through something of that wisdom which perceives in all nature one single principle, indivisible and incorruptible, not separate in the separate object seen, and which is of the sattva quality. It is the changeless self within, which, if we follow the lines of our determination, we will come to realize more and more. There can be no realization of self in that kind of knowledge which perceives different and manifold principles as present in the world of created beings, or in that knowledge wholly without value, which is mean, attached to one object alone, as if it were the whole, which does not see the true cause of existence. All our thoughts give rise to action among the lives which compose our astral physical instrument. And as we never cease thinking, action continually goes on. For as often said, thought is the real plane of action. Even though we may not contemplate any immediate bodily act, we may by our thoughts accumulate a tendency in the lives of our instrument which will eventually result in outward action, whenever favouring conditions permit, and we will fall victims to our lack of discernment and steadfastness, as well as involve others in our fate. Now here what are the three kinds of pleasure, wherein happiness comes from habitude or habit and pain is ended. We may get some understanding of this sentence if we consider that when some ardently desired aim or object is sought and found, there is at first happiness, and the pain of non-attainment is ended. But the happiness does not remain the same. It resolves itself into contentment and habitude until the latter becomes wearisome and another aim or object is sought. That which in the beginning is a poison, and in the end as the water of life, and which arises from a purified understanding, is declared to be of the sattva quality. The pursuit of desires brings a beginning of sweetness and an ending of bitterness. The pleasure gained from idleness, carelessness and indifference stupefies the soul. To arouse oneself from desiring or from carelessness and indifference is at first as poison, but with a purified understanding becomes the water of life. So now we'll have our talk.
So friends, I hope you can see the screen all right, and those on Skype, trust you can see that. We've got a few slides to show you. So this evening we're going to be going back a long time in history, 9,000 years to begin with, to the very first times of ancient Egypt. And believing as we do in reincarnation, it's more than probable that we will have been living in those civilizations that we're going to explore tonight. So this is something we can't consciously recall at the moment, but it's said that when you reach a certain point in spiritual development, you can begin to discover more and more about your previous lives. So as we go through this, we'll try and pick out some of the lessons of history that teach us and try to put into perspective where we are now at the beginning of the 21st century, because we're at a very interesting time. We've had almost 2,000 years of the Dark Ages in Europe and the West, and since 1875 a great effort has been made to try to go back to the fundamental ideals that inspired those great civilizations that we're going to be looking at tonight, particularly the Egyptians and the Druids and the Druzes. So we'll begin with a little overview. Let's see if we can get this. So we're going to trace the historical influences that created the great Egyptian society and its value. So we'll start with Egypt and see where we go from there. Now, in Theosophy, we talk about the lineage of the doctrine and the knowledge and the wisdom that has been given out and was always preserved even during these dark periods. And this is a quotation from H.P. Blavatsky. Let's just see if we can move the Skype out of the way a little. So she says, thus even in the days of Aristotle, few were the true adepts left in Europe and even in Egypt. So Aristotle was, 300 BC, 250? The heirs of those who had been dispersed by the conquering swords of various invaders, and we'll talk about those a little later, of old Egypt, had been dispersed in their turn. As 8,000 or 9,000 years earlier than today, the stream of knowledge had been slowly running down from the tablelands of Central Asia into India and towards Europe and Northern Africa. So that about 500 BC, it had begun to flow backwards toward its old home and birthplace. Now, and the birthplace was Asia. So what that's saying is that from about 9,000 or 7,000 BC, 9,000 years ago, there was a stream of knowledge coming from the high plateaus, the tablelands of Central Asia, from West China, into India. And then that went on for a long period of perhaps, whatever that is, 6,000 or 7,000 years. And then that began to wane as the New Age came in, the Dark Ages came into Europe. So if you can see on the map, you've got Western China, Tibet, India, and then these influences from around 7,000 BC began to spread through, and we'll see actually that it came via Ethiopia largely, up through Sudan, and I'm not sure how we go backwards in a minute. So up through Sudan, which is ancient Nubia, that's it. Yeah. Into Egypt, through Libya, through Algeria, Morocco, across the Straits of Gibraltar, which were in fact a solid causeway at that time. There was no break in the Straits of Gibraltar. Up through France and eventually across into Britain and Ireland. And again, at that time, Britain and Ireland were all connected to the mainland. Now, let's carry on a little. So that which is known of the priests of Egypt and of the ancient Brahmins, corroborated as it is by all the ancient classics and historical writers, gives us the right to believe in that which is only tradition in the opinion of skeptics. So what Madame Blavatsky is saying here is that if you manage to put all the pieces of evidence together, which is what she did in Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine, you can form a perfectly coherent set of beliefs, which, in the opinion of skeptics, is only something they dismiss as being traditional. And then she asks, where did the wonderful knowledge of the Egyptian priests in every department of science come from, unless they had it from a still more ancient source? And we'll go into that later on. Now, these Brahmins that were mentioned, who were the Brahmins and who were the Egyptian priests? And she says in an article called The Origin of the Mysteries, there were no Brahmins as a hereditary caste in the days of old. In those long departed ages, a man became a Brahmin through personal merit. That's very interesting. And initiation. So the Brahmins in the old days were all initiated. Gradually, however, despotism crept in, and the sons of a Brahmin, and the son of a Brahmin was created a Brahmin by right of protection first, and then by that of heredity. The rights of blood replaced those of real merit, and thus arose the body of Brahmins, which was soon changed into a powerful caste. Now, interestingly, the very same thing happened in ancient Egypt. When we talk about Egypt as being a theocratically governed society, the theocracy of the priests was a philosophical one. It was not hereditary, and it was not particularly religious. The priests were above all philosophers. And so ancient Egypt was actually governed on a thoroughly philosophical basis, which happened to have, as all good philosophy should, a very strong spiritual component. And that's something very different from the theocracy that we wind up with later on. But the early theocracies were purely merit-based and philosophical. Now, let's have a look at Egypt in a little bit of detail. In an article, the same article actually, The Origins of the Mysteries. Now, that article we're going to be studying by happy chance next Sunday. So do come, because we'll have a chance to read through the whole article, hopefully. So do come next Sunday. Now, what she says in that article is very interesting on Egypt. There's 4 ancient seats of learning in Old Egypt. Thebes, down at the bottom. That's in what they call Upper Egypt. It's on the Nile. It's what's now called Luxor. And that they taught the science of occult numbers, particularly. Madame Blavatsky tells us. Memphis, which is up towards the north, it's just south of Cairo. You can see that on the map. Was particularly where they taught metaphysics. Sais was a centre of religious legislation and the art of government. And Heliopolis, which is just slightly north of Cairo, you can probably see it there, was a centre of mathematics. So if we zoom in on the map a bit, you can see Heliopolis there, the city of the sun god. There's Memphis, next to the Great Pyramid of Cheops and the Sphinx. And just up here is Sais, where they taught legislation and government. So let's start with Thebes, or Luxor as it was. Now, these are the old columns of the temples, and you can see the scale down here. You've got some workers. So these columns are probably, I don't know how many meters high, perhaps 70, 80 feet to 20, 30 meters high. And in Thebes, HPB tells us it was the great Theban sanctuary that Pythagoras, upon his arrival from India, so Pythagoras started in Greece, went to India, returned via Egypt, studied the science of occult numbers. So that was one of the great seats of learning. And that's a view of these wonderful old temples that are still in remarkably good condition. I mean, they cover acres and acres of ground, and the workmanship is second to none. You couldn't reproduce it today. Now, we mentioned Pythagoras, and Orpheus was another one who came from India. So let's read what Madame Blavatsky says about Orpheus in her article, The Mystery, Son of Initiation. In Egypt, the mysteries had been known since the days of Menes. He was one of the early pharaohs, accepted as around 3000 BC. And that the Greeks received these mysteries only when Orpheus introduced them from India. That's very interesting. Orpheus was about 3000 BC. In an article was writing known before Panini, It is stated that the Pandus had required universal dominion and had taught the sacrificial mysteries to other races as far back as 3300 BC. Now, in the footnote there, we say that Orpheus and Arjuna are equated as being the same person. Krishna died around 3102 BC. His successful disciple, Arjuna Orpheus, taught the Eastern Raja Yoga system and founded a long dynasty in the new Grecian world. And that's very interesting because the Orphic tradition in Greece seemed to have been taught about 3000 BC, and it was probably that tradition that led to the great Grecian flowering. But Orpheus was actually Arjuna. And it was Arjuna that travelled around the world teaching this, what are they called, the sacrificial mysteries. He also travelled through South America. And I think he married one of the daughters of a South American king. HPB tells us. So let's move on to Memphis. Memphis, if you remember, was just a few kilometres south of Cairo. It was in Memphis that Orpheus popularized his too abstruse Indian metaphysics for the use of Magna Graecia, and thence Thales and, ages later, Democritus obtained all they knew. So that's telling us, really, that Orpheus planted some seeds, initially in Egypt and then later on in Greece when he went back to his home country. And in Memphis, this is an artist's depiction of the great temple of Ptah, or Ptah, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, P-T-A-H. And you can see the size of this. I mean, these statues outside the temple are probably 20 or 30 feet high. So everything in Egypt was done on an absolutely colossal scale. I mean, their buildings were fantastic. I've never been there myself, but perhaps some of you here have been to Egypt and have seen these enormous buildings. Now, moving on to Sais. Sais was just between Cairo and the coast, in the Nile Delta. It is to Sais that all the honour must be given of the wonderful legislation and the art of ruling people, the art of government, imparted by its priests to Lycurgus, is it Lycurgus? Lycurgus, thank you, and Solon. Solon was the one who Plato got a lot of his information from, who will both remain objects of admiration for generations to come. And it's interesting that the modern view that Sais was only actually discovered recently by archaeologists, I think probably only properly about in the 1980s, and that they now recognise, and the modern view is that the erstwhile capital that was once comparable in importance and grandeur to the famed cities of Memphis or Thebes. So Sais was very, very important, but not much of it is left now. It all seems to have been dismantled. But they had these enormous big temples at Sais, covering square kilometres. So the last one of these four seats is Heliopolis, the city of the sun. And HPB writes, and had Plato and Eudoxius never gone to worship at the shrine of Heliopolis, most probably the one would have never astonished future generations with his ethics, that's Plato, nor the other with his wonderful knowledge of mathematics. So these were taught at those centres of learning. So these were three great centres in Egypt, probably managed and organised and administered by these initiated priests or hierophants, some of them who would have been connected to the government of Egypt through the pharaohs. So that gives you a little information. Now, regarding the hieroglyphics, Madame Blavatsky writes, the mysteries preceded the hieroglyphics. So the mysteries, as we heard earlier, were given from about 7000 BC. They preceded the hieroglyphics. They gave birth to them, as permanent records were needed to preserve and commemorate their secrets. And she goes on to write, it is primitive philosophy, or early philosophy, pure philosophy, that had served as the foundation stone for modern philosophy. Their progeny perpetuating it, or the modern, had lost its way, had lost on its way the soul and spirit of its parents. Now, if you look up on hieroglyphics in, for instance, Wikipedia, you'll see that they have an exoteric rendering and that it works. So you've got the two main figures here are the beetle and the figure of the deity. And then round the beetle you've got these four things they call complementaries, which frame the sign of the scarab beetle. And that whole assemblage of however many it is, 6 symbols, reads exoterically the name of the god Khepri. But what about the esoteric meaning of that, which is presumably still secret, still lost? Now, going back to the article that we're going to read next Sunday, Madame Blavatsky says that ages later in the 5th, the Aryan race, some unscrupulous priests began to take advantage of the too easy beliefs of the people in every country and finally raised those secondary powers to the rank of gods and gods, thus succeeding in isolating them altogether from the one universal cause of all causes. Now, who were these secondary gods? These are really the terrestrial or lower cosmic powers. These are not the pure, noumenal, spiritual, pure gods of the ancients. So these are, and so what she's saying here is that the pure ancient wisdom that was the abode of the initiated adepts in the sanctuaries began to get degraded, and they began to give power to more of the psychic entities, the lower terrestrial forces of the psychic gods, the astral forces. And that really began the fall of ideals, and that was started, she says, later on in the Aryan race. And the same thing had happened to the Atlanteans in the 4th race. The degeneration of the mystery schools. Now, what was the consequence of that? Unfortunately, we can see it in Christianity. I mean, this is an example from an article by Madame Blavatsky, Thoughts on the Elementals. And she's rather caricaturing the Christian beliefs. She says, the blessed St. Anthony, having inquired into who he was, the little dwarf of the woods, so this is St. Anthony obviously having psychic communication with one of these entities. The little dwarf of the woods answered, "I am a mortal. I am one of the inhabitants of the wilderness, whom gentility, or the people, under its various delusions, worships, under the name of fauns, satyrs, and incubi, or the spirits of the dead." Might have added this elemental. So they're worshipped under the names, the spirits of the dead. Might have added this elemental, the vehicle of some elementary. Now, do you all know the difference between the elementary and the elemental? So the spirits of the dead are the elementaries, the ones who haven't been sufficiently spiritual in order to reach into Devachan and have a conscious, blissful existence in the heavenly state. They become trapped on the psychic astral planes as elementaries because they've led very, very materialistic, wicked, bad lives on earth, and that has kept them. There's nothing spiritual about their lives, and they've been kept on these lower planes, and very often that they use the elementals in order to communicate with unsuspecting people like St. Anthony, who had thought probably that these elementals should be worshipped under the names of the fauns. Do you know about the fauns? I think it's a Greek term, is it?
Yeah. They're half man, half
the satyrs and the fauns, yes.
the centaurs.
They don't sound very nice. And the incubi and the succubi are dreadful elementals connected with sexual mispractice. So this is all the result of what happens when you lose the real mysteries, and when these are substituted for astral psychic entities that like to try to communicate with people. And you see this today. I mean, a lot of possessions or a lot of unfortunate criminal activity is inspired through these lower entities trying to get their kicks. It's going on today. It's always been going on. Now, just as a historical aside, we said at the beginning that we had a large period of the Dark Ages when the mysteries had fallen, and that Christianity hadn't been able to help that. The work of Jesus, whoever that historical figure was, hadn't been able to truly stem the tide of materialism, and we went through, as a race, we must have all lived through these times, particularly difficult times. And this is what HPB says about it. The knowledge of the existence of the great adepts nearly died out in Europe, nearly died out. Nevertheless, in some secret places, the mysteries were still enacted in all their primitive purity. The sun of righteousness still blazed high on the midnight sky. And it was midnight because these sacred ceremonies had to be conducted under the cover of darkness for their own protection. It seems that's what's being implied. Still blazed high on the midnight sky, and while the darkness was upon the face of the profane world, there was the eternal light in the Adita, or the inner sanctuary, on the nights of initiation. The true mysteries were never made public during this time, the last 2,000 years. Eleusinia and the Agri were for the multitudes. So even these Eleusinian mysteries were not the highest ones. So that's all we've got time for on Egypt. So we can have an opportunity to come back and answer questions and read a little bit more about Egypt if you'd like to, and take some references up in well, particularly Isis Unveiled actually has got a lot of very good things on Egypt. So let's now move to the Druzes of Mount Lebanon, who are, if you remember that map of where Lebanon was, it's just slightly up to the, sort of on the right-hand side, sort of northeast of Egypt in Syria, just above Syria. And the Druzes are very, very interesting. And all the information that we're going to take is from an article by Madame Blavatsky on the Druzes. And you can see in the Druze populations today, about 500,000 in Syria, perhaps a bit less now. Probably more now in Lebanon, because there's been such a shift in population. Almost 250,000. 150,000 in Israel and 20,000 in Jordan. So they're still quite a force, the Druzes. This is from Wikipedia. This is the sort of common knowledge about the Druzes today. They say, although dwarfed by other larger communities, the Druze community played an important role in the shaping of the history of the Levant, or that part of the world, the Middle East, and continues to play a large political role there. As a religious minority in every country they live in, that they have lived in, they have frequently experienced persecution, except in Lebanon and Israel, where Druze judges, parliamentarians, diplomats and doctors occupy the highest echelons of society. So they're quite well respected in Lebanon and Israel. Now, what does Theosophy say about the Druzes? So in Madame Blavatsky's article, Lamas and Druzes, which is where all these quotations are going to come from, she says, "We humbly maintain that they are the descendants of and a mixture of mystics of all nations." So the Druzes, a mixture of and descendants of mystics of all nations. That's very interesting. Mystics who, in the face of cruel and unrelenting persecution by Orthodox Christianity and Islam, have ever since the first centuries of the Mohammedan propaganda been gathered together, and who gradually made a permanent settlement in the fastnesses of Syria and Mount Lebanon, where they had from the first found refuge. Now it's interesting that Mount Lebanon was actually was part of Syria. It's now occupied as the Golan Heights, and part of that is now occupied by Israel. Yeah, there's a handout. Yeah. And since then, they have preserved the strictest silence upon their beliefs and their truly occult rites. So they're very secretive, the Druzes. They still are today. They don't say much about their beliefs, because they have been persecuted a lot. So that's a portrait of a Druze, rather refined, elderly, probably one of their elders. That's a relatively recent picture. So the Druzes of Mount Lebanon, they are the Sikhs of Asia Minor, and their polity offers many points of similarity with the late commonwealth of the followers of Guru Nanak. So Madame Blavatsky here is comparing them directly to the Sikhs, even extending to their mysticism and their indomitable bravery. But the two are still more closely related to a third and still more mysterious community of religionists, of which nothing or next to nothing is known by outsiders. We mean that fraternity of Tibetan Lamaists, known as the Brotherhood of Kailang, who mix but little with the rest. So there's a direct connection she's making between the Druzes, the Sheiks, and this mystical Tibetan Lamaist community or fraternity, the Brotherhood of Kailang. And we'll come back to this later on, because there's a very interesting connection between the Druzes and Tibet. So that's a picture of a Druze bride from the 1890s, Very magnificent she looks. Very interesting headdress, by the way. Do you think that's symbolical of something?
Crown chakra.
Could be. Wonderful headdress. Now let's carry on what Madame Blavatsky is talking about the Druzes. She says it is actually improper to call them Druzes, as they regard it as an insult. Nor are they in reality the followers of Drauzi, a heretical people of Lhamsa, or Hamsa. Hamsa was the founder of the Druze, but the true disciples of the latter. So it's rather unfortunate they've been wound up Christian or named after one of the heretical ones, but actually they're the true disciples of Hamsa. The origin of that personage, who appeared among them in the 11th century, coming from Central Asia, whose secret or mystery name is El Hama, is quite unknown to European scholars. His special titles are Universal Source or Mind, Ocean of Light, Absolute or Divine Intelligence. So these are all the titles for El Hama. In short, repetitions of those same titles of the Tibetan Dalai Lama. So that's very suggestive of where El Hama got his teachings from, because he came from Central Asia. So that's a picture of some of the Druze elders from the Golan Heights, which used to be in Syria, where the Druzes lived, and now occupied by Israel, where, as we saw at the beginning, roughly 150,000 of the Druzes still live. The fine-looking body of elders. Now, a little bit more on government. The system of government is set down as feudal and satriarchal. I'm not sure what that means. While it is as theocratic as that of the Lionists, or as that of the Sikhs, as it used to be. Theocratic as it used to be. Now, we said at the beginning that the original theocracy was run based on merit, not hereditary. So the initiates were initiated philosophers who were initiated into the sacred rites of the ancient sanctuaries. The mysterious representation of the deity appears in Hamsa, whose spirit is said to guide them and periodically reincarnate itself in the person of the chief Okhal of the Druzes. So doesn't that sound like the Dalai Lamas? Just like the Dalai Lamas. As it does in the Guru Kings of the Sheikhs. The same thing with the Sheikhs. So they have a reincarnating group of teachers who are there to guide their followers. Some of whom, like Guru Govind, claim to be the reincarnations of Nanak. Oh, here we are. Yeah, while the Dalai Lamas of Tibet claim to be those of Buddha. I'm not sure that's still the case. But,
I have a question.
Yeah.
How could such a sect arise during the period of Islam? This was the height of Islam right across this region.
Well, I think...
And why would this El Hamza start a school in Lebanon?
Well, see, what HPB seems to be saying in this article is that the Druzes were the descendants of the exiles of the mystery schools.
Kelang.
No, they were taught by the Keling from Tibet, but they were exiled probably from Egypt and Greece and Rome. I mean, we know that...
They closed the mystery schools. I mean, those
Yes.
are the ones who went east.
That's right.
After, what was the emperor who closed them? Justinian, was it?
Well,
Sixth
Justinian
century.
did some, yes.
They closed the last schools in Greece.
Yeah, that's right.
And they went to Baghdad and places like that.
Well, some of them went to Baghdad, but what Madame Blavatsky seems to be saying here is that a lot of them wound up in the Lebanon and Syria. But she said earlier on, if you remember, that there are the mixtures of many races. So they're like they obviously had a spiritual community and centre where all these initiates would have...
An international fraternity.
An international fraternity, yeah.
Actually, Islam was very tolerant at that time. So
Yes.
that's
Islam welcomed them to Baghdad.
yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know the Druze, the origin of the Druze? Do you know how it's about? It was a mad Caliph al-Hakim, a fatimid caliph, who eventually disappeared.
Well, I'm not sure if that's
He
the
created the
idea.
Druze, he disappeared, and the Druze sect considered him the founder of the religion. Al-Hakim, the fatimid Ismaili caliph, who he...
Yeah, but that's not according to theosophy.
That's the official doctrine, isn't it?
That's the exoteric one.
Yes,
But the esoteric one is this one.
this one, yes.
From what I understand, just from what
Yes.
H.P. Blavatsky's written. Because Hamza, I'm not sure if we can go back to that page. Here we are. The one who founded the Druzes was Hamza.
Hamza.
Elhams.
El Hamza. No, he came from Asia.
Mm.
But he may, I mean, in the exoteric version, he may have become that person whose name you mentioned.
Al-Hakim, the Caliph Al-Hakim, the mad Caliph Al-Hakim, who disappeared by testimony Jews, and Jews consider him, well, the official line is that he was the founder of religion.
No, but that's not what Madame Blavatsky says. You see,
No,
that doesn't
but
agree.
You know about the story. You knew about it.
Yeah, all right. Well, that's a bit of a diversion.
But none of that.
We'll
Yeah.
all right. Let's just go on a bit. So a little bit on the religion. The religion of the Druzes is said to be a compound of Judaism, Mohammedanism, Christianity, strongly tinged with Gnosticism and the Magian system of Persia. So that probably tells you where the Druzes came from as ethnic subgroups. Were people to call them things by their right names, sacrificing self-conceit to truth, they could say, for instance, that Mohammedanism, being a compound of Chaldeanism, Christianity and Judaism, Christianity a mixture of Judaism, Gnosticism and paganism. That's interesting. And Judaism a wholesale Egypto-Chaldean Kabbalism, masquerading under invented names and fables, made to fit the bits and scraps of the real history of the Israelite tribes. Then the religious system of the Druzes would then be found to be one of the last survivals of the archaic wisdom religion. Now that's very interesting, because what she's saying there is that the Druzes are the last surviving remnants of the old wisdom tradition.
What should their correct name be? If it's offensive to say Druzes, Hamas?
I don't know. Well, the Hamas, yeah. Or Hamza, not Hamas. Hamza. But I mean, they call themselves Druzes now. So now this is a little bit about how they operate. Many manuscripts, Druze manuscripts, have never left the underground holoways, or the places of religious meetings, invariably built under the meeting room on the ground floor. And the public Thursdays assemblies of the Druzes are simply blinds intended for over-curious travellers and the neighbours. So obviously they were living amongst other faiths, so they had a system of public meetings and secret meetings. No more than the Druzes do the Lamaists, or the Tibetans, seek to make proselytes. Both people have their schools of magic, those in Tibet being attached to some La Kang, is it? Or the Lamasris, and those among the Druzes in their closely guarded crypts of initiation, no stranger being even allowed inside the buildings.
So how did HPB get all this knowledge?
Well,
If
she was allowed in, actually. She had a passport of some sort that, and she was admitted into one of the secret meetings of the Druzes. Now, how she got in, she was probably helped by her masters, because, as we'll see later on, the Druzes are actually in very close touch with the Tibetan lamas. Oh, here we are. This is the slide. So they have 7 yearly visits to Western China. This is Madame Blavatsky writing in the same article, Lamas and Druzes. To conclude with the Druzes, as Selama and Boha Eddin,
Boha Eddin.
Boha Eddin, thank you. The two names more than suggestive of the words Lama and Buddha, or Bodha, are the only ones entrusted with the secret of Hamsa's retreat. And having means of consulting with their master, they produce from time to time his directions and commands to the Brotherhood. So even to this day do the Okals of that name travel every 7th year through Busra, or Basra, that's in
Iran. On the Gulf.
Through the Gulf.
Oh, is it Iraq?
It's Iraq, that's right. It's Iraq, yeah, Basra. It's Basra of today.
Yeah.
Big port. They could go through Basra and Persia into Tartary or Afghanistan. So. To Tibet.
Mongolia.
Mongolia, that's right. Tibet and the very west of China, and return at the expiration of the 11th year. So they probably take quite a long time to get there, but they spend 4 years travelling. And they return on the 11th year, bringing them fresh orders from El Hama. So it seems that the Druzes are really like an outpost of Tibetan
Buddhism.
Esoteric Buddhism. Yeah. And that's not surprising actually when you think about it, because all the initiated adepts from Egypt and Greece and all those places seem to have wound up forming that brotherhood, the Druze brotherhood.
So HPB wrote that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's all from that article, Lamas and Druzes. Yeah. It's in the Theosophist, September 1881. It was published. Oh, I've done something wrong. What's happened?
It's got a definition of satriarchal there. It's similar to patriarchal.
Druid cities, is that where we are? That's it. Oh no. We need to go. Sorry, I've gone wrong here. Quick slideshow for those who came late. Gone too far.
That's it.
So that's it. All we've got time for on the Druzes. So the last one we're going to talk about tonight very briefly, just a little bit on some of the Druid cities of Europe, just very briefly to finish up. We're just going to take two examples that HPB mentions, both in sort of north-central France, quite near to Switzerland, about 100 kilometres west of Switzerland. The first one we'll look at is Alicia. It's now called Saint-Reine in the Côte d'Or. Now let's just go back one stage to take a historical perspective. There was, as we said, there was an Egyptian exodus of Egyptian initiates. And in the article "The Last Mysteries of Europe" by HPB, she writes, "The Egyptian sacred scribes and hierophants, or initiates, or masters, became wanderers upon the face of the earth. Those who had remained in Egypt found themselves obliged, for fear of a profanation of the sacred mysteries, to seek refuge in deserts and mountains, and to form and establish secret societies and brotherhoods, such as," now this is interesting, "the Essenes." So obviously the Druzes as well, but such as the Essenes. "And those who had crossed the oceans to India and even to the New World." So that's America or South America. So from Egypt, when all the problems arose, all these hierophants and scribes left and formed their own communities. Now, a little bit about Alicia. She says, "The cycle of such and such," she doesn't tell us which one, "being at its close," that's around 100 BC. It's presumably she's talking about the cycle before Pisces. Aries, is it the cycle of Aries?
Mars, same thing.
Is it? Yeah. "The cycle of such and such being at its close, the first hour for the disappearance of the mysteries struck on the clock of the races with the Macedonian conqueror Alexander." So the first hour struck when Alexander went and did his rampaging through the Levant or the Middle East.
Persia, Afghanistan, even India.
Yeah, he went to India.
Gave the Zoroastrians a hard time.
Baghdad, conquered
Yes. I
the
mean,
civilized world.
he's called Alexander the Great, but HPB doesn't call him great. He calls him
In Persia they call him terrible.
terrible. Yeah,
And the one Indian guru called him a vandal.
That's right. Now, its last hour. When was Alexander? Do you remember?
About 350 BC.
Yeah.
350 BC. So this
320, 350 BC.
So this period of dissolution of the mysteries started 300 BC, finished about 50 BC. The last hour sounded in the year 47 BC. Alicia, the famous city in Gaul, the Thebes of the Celts. So she's comparing it to Thebes, this wonderful French city, so renowned for its ancient rites of initiation and mysteries, was, as J.M. Ragon well describes it, the ancient metropolis and tomb of initiation, of the religion of the Druids and the freedom of Gaul. So it was the ancient metropolis of the tomb of initiation, or the centre of initiation, called a tomb, but I mean, Ragon wasn't an initiate.
Well, but there's sort of vast universities there,
Yes.
run by the Druids,
Yeah.
open air universities, all using the oral tradition,
That's right.
oral teaching.
But the religion, what's interesting is it says the religion of the Druids and the freedom of Gaul. Now, Gaul was old France. But this religion of the Druids was clearly a very beneficial, beautiful, spiritual religion that gave Gaul her freedom and her strength and her nobility and intelligence and compassion, that made Gaul the wonderful place that it used to be for all those druidical societies. So that's a little bit about Alesia. Oh, sorry, we've got some more. So this is really the end of the mysteries in Europe and Africa and Egypt, which were then to go underground for 2,000 years. And HPB writes, history shows that the populations of central Gaul, or France, revolting against the Roman yoke, or domination by Rome. The country was subject to Caesar, and the revolt was crushed, so the Romans crushed the revolt. The result was the slaughter of the garrison at Alesia, and of all its inhabitants, including the Druids, the college priests, and the neophytes, or the students. So the whole lot were slaughtered by the Romans. After this, the whole city was plundered and razed to the ground. So that's the effect of Roman vandalism on the ancient wisdom. Sad to say. So this is a picture of Saint-Laurent, as it is called now. Seems to be a nice little French country city.
Village.
What is the number of Druids there in central France?
The number of Druids?
Yeah.
It's a good question. Probably very large.
Very large.
Very large, probably. Probably running into millions.
How much?
Millions. Oh, at a guess.
Guess how much?
Millions.
Millions.
Well,
So do you mean followers of the Druids, or of that
yeah,
religion?
followers of the Druids. Yeah.
Druid religion,
Hmm.
or cult, or whatever.
Well, let's go on. That's a good question, and I'm only guessing, but there's quite a lot
Yeah.
given in the next.
Estimate.
Hmm. So let's go to the next. Now, Bibractus was the other one we're going to look at. It's in the same article by Madame Blavatsky, The Last Mysteries in Europe. By the way, this presentation is all on the website if you want to have a look at it. Bibractus, she writes, Bibractus, the mother of sciences. That's a lovely title to give a town. The mother of sciences, the soul of the early nations in Europe. The soul of the early nations in Europe. I mean, what praise is that? A town equally famous for its sacred college of Druids, its civilization, its schools, in which 40,000 students were taught philosophy, literature, grammar, jurisprudence. That rings a bell. Do you remember in SAS they had the study of law and government, or jurisprudence, same thing. The study of medicine, astrology, occult sciences, architecture, etc.
So where was it?
Bibractus. This is it's not far from Alesia. It's sort of northern.
Still in France.
Yeah, about 100 kilometers west
The
of
modern Autun.
Autun. That's right. Yeah, you know it. Yeah.
No,
Autun.
we had it before.
Yeah. Good memory. So a little bit more on Bibractus. It was called the rival of Thebes, of Memphis, of Athens, and of Rome. It possessed an amphitheatre accommodating 100,000 spectators. So that's bigger than Wembley. Or is it back Wembley? 100,000?
I think it's bigger than Rome, yeah.
Bit bigger than Wembley. An amphitheatre. A capital. Temples of Janus, god of the two-faced god of the beginning of and the end of the year. January, we get that from. Pluto, Prosperian, Jupiter, Apollo. I mean, there's more actually. I cut some of them out in the articles. Anubis, so it had an Egyptian.
The jackal god.
jackal god, yeah.
Jackal-headed god.
And something called a namaki, thank you, which is a vast basin, like a pond or lake. Gigantic work wherein floated boats and galleys or ships rowed by oars, devoted to naval games, an aqueduct, fountains, public baths, all the constructions dating from the heroic ages, so very, very ancient for practice. So that's all we've got time for. Now, we can either do a little bit of study together using some ISIS Unveiled copies which we've got at the back, or we can have just a question and answer session on anything that you've read in the slides. What would you like?
Question answer.
Yeah?
Answer questions.
Okay.
Are you implying there was a connection between the Druids and ancient Egypt?
Yes.
That they were perhaps one of these exiled fraternity adepts who opened a new school in southern France? Because with the Druids they were pre-Celtic.
Well, now let's read, that's a very interesting question. Let's read something about that. Now, there's a few. So in the Secret Doctrine, she says, she talks about these what she calls cyclopean structures. Structures very, very ancient. For instance, Stonehenge, cyclopean, or the French Karnak. Yeah. And she says, nor were all such cyclopean structures intended for sepulchres or burial grounds, because very often all the modern archaeologists seem to connect them with burial grounds. It is with the so-called druidical remains, such as Karnak in Brittany and Stonehenge in Great Britain, that the travelling initiates above alluded to. Now these travelling initiates were the Egyptians. The Egyptians used to travel all round. We'll read that in a minute, actually. The travelling initiates alluded to above had to do. So they were set up by these travelling initiates, these cyclopean structures, before the Druids. And these gigantic monuments are all symbolic records of the world's history. So somehow those long rows of ancient standing stones were historical records.
And where's that from?
Excuse me, can you remove the presentation from the screen?
Yep. Yeah, thanks, Steve. We can do that, certainly. Let's go back to Skype. Stop sharing. That's it.
Ah, there you are. Thank you.
That's probably a bit better. You can see what's going on. Now, she says, these gigantic monuments were symbolic records of the world's history. They were not druidical, but universal. Nor did the Druids build them. They were only heirs to the cyclopean law left to them by generations of mighty builders, magicians both good and bad. And now she says, more modern archaeologists, this is from The Secret Doctrine again, volume 2, page 750. More modern archaeologists will not give it, the pyramid, an antiquity of more than 5,000 or at the most 6,000 years. and generously concede to Thebes, with its 100 gates, 7,000 years from the date of its foundation. But she's actually suggesting the pyramid may be...
Far older.
Yeah, well, she quotes Bunsen, who gives it 20,000 years.
Only.
Yeah, but it's probably...
20,000.
Yeah, it was probably older than that. And she carries on, and yet there are records which show Egyptian priests, initiates, journeying in a northwesterly direction by land via what became later the Straits of Gibraltar. So do you remember on the map we saw the Straits of Gibraltar? Turning north, so going from Africa to Europe, which was all one landmass, travelling through the future Phoenician settlements of southern Gaul. So this is before Phoenician times, these Egyptians. Then further north still, reaching Karnak in France. Then they turned west again and arrived, still travelling by land, on the northwestern promontory of the new continent, which is, she says, is the British Isles, which were not detached from the main continent in those days. So that was something like 10,000 years ago, wasn't it?
And they think that there's a man called L.A. Waddle who looked into this, and he thinks Menes is buried in Ireland, that pharaoh you talked about earlier.
Oh, really? Menes?
Yeah, and there's a hill in Ireland with a name that sounds like Menes, and he was saying that the Egyptians were coming back in them times to Britain because they were looking for tin.
Oh, that's interesting.
We were the only country that had tin.
What was his name?
L.A. Waddle, W-A-D-D-E-L-L.
W-A-D-D-E-L-L. Oh, that's very good.
Book.
Yeah. We'll look him up.
I think even the Phoenicians came to Cornwall to trade tin. It
Yes.
was quite ancient, that trade.
And that's what they think the Egyptians, this is what this Waddle was saying, they were coming to Cornwall, but then Menes carried on up to Ireland, and he got stung by a bee and died in Ireland.
Was there encyclopedia structures in Ireland as well, like New Grange?
Yes, New Grange.
And probably several others.
Yeah. Now, there's something we need to correct, which is a popular misconception that was... Do you remember there was someone called Donnelly who wrote Atlantis, the antediluvian world?
Ignatius Donnelly.
Ignatius Donnelly. Do you remember when that was published?
About 1868, I think.
1860s, okay. Now, HPB says that was quite a... Well, let's just read what she says. This is from an article called The 17 Rayed Sun Disk. We've taken it up before. And it speaks about the connection between Copan in South America, is it Mexico?
Mexico, maybe?
Mexico. And the connection between Copan and Brazil. Egypt. There's a strong connection between Mexico and Egypt. And it was probably...
The ziggurats, I mean
the pyramids line up.
Yes.
The pyramids in Egypt and
similar culture.
Yeah.
Cultures.
Well, as she said, the Egyptians, when they left, when they were persecuted, they went to the new world, which may have included Mexico.
Well, they also found in a lot of the tombs in Egypt cocaine that would have only come from Mexico and places like that. But also what you were saying about the pyramids being lined up, they're all in the 33rd parallel. So there's something about that 33rd parallel that goes around the earth. There's lots of things linked, not just the pyramids in Mexico and Egypt. There's other things as well that are on that line.
For example?
I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, I can't remember.
Well, ley lines and
to look it up.
Stuff like that.
Something about the Arthurian legend.
Okay. We'll have a look at our Skype comments. Well, let's look at that now. Thank you for... I think it was Will who sent that through. Let's just go to Skype. So Will's asked a question. Can we draw a parallel between the loss the loss of discrimination of these ancient priests and the people they convinced that led to confuse the psychic lower forces with the spiritual deities, with what happened with the Judeo-Christian tradition with Jehovah. And that's interesting. With Jehovah being identified with the higher powers. In other traditions, the Cosmocrators mistaken for the Dhyani Buddhas. And in the New Age movement, with the common confusion between the psycho-astral realm and the spiritual one, yes. In the context of karma and reincarnation, is it a universal reoccurring challenge humanity has to go through periodically? That's a very interesting question, and a very well-worded question, actually. Yes, I mean, the fall of ideals seems
There seems to be a
permanent.
cycle behind it.
Mm,
Cycles of rising and falling.
yeah, and lose the spiritual impulse and things become material. I mean, it's said that religion has become materialized.
Dogmatized.
Well, even in the Garden of Eden, it is the Elohim who say, now man has become like us. Which is an interesting double phrase when you think about it, especially in regards to what we're talking about.
Thanks, Steve. Yes, I mean, this is common throughout all the traditions, and it's something particularly that Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophical movement was very keen to stress at the beginning, was the integrity and preservation of spirituality over psychic attractions.
Can we say what that means in more simple terms?
Well, it means, in Raja Yoga, for instance, when you meditate, if you sit down to meditate, you have to pass through the psychic condition of swapna in order to get to the higher spiritual condition of shushupti. I mean, you do it when you go to sleep. When you dream, you're in the psychic condition. But your spiritual experience when you're asleep comes in the swapna, in the shushupti, in the highest, dreamless state. And the same is true in meditation. You see, you have to break through the barrier of mental activity, which is mostly psychic, into the spiritual realm, which is higher monastic and impersonal and kind and charitable and unselfish and all the attributes.
So when it comes to intuition, what we're talking about here is discerning where this intuition is coming from. If it's coming from a psychic
That's right.
level or a spiritual level.
That's right. And if you hear voices in your head and things like that, it's 9 times out of 10 not going to be spiritual.
But intuition is by definition a spiritual faculty.
Well,
the higher senses.
It should be pure intuition, but as HPB says, don't trust your intuition unless you've tested it. She says because most people's intuition is not that pure. It's tainted, you see.
Would we think that this intuition is somehow linked with the universal consciousness?
Yes, absolutely. Pure intuition.
Well, that's what it is.
Yes, it
There
is.
is no witnessing involved in that. It's a direct connection.
I think that's what it is. It's a translation of something, perfect cognition.
Yes.
And but these very, very high states of samadhi, when one can achieve that, I mean, it's quite rare.
But you don't have to be in samadhi to have intuition.
No, you don't. And
you have to be in a normal. You could be in the normal conscious state.
But what our friend was saying was that direct, perfect perception of spiritual reality is very special. I mean, what our intuition is a translation of that somehow talks to us and tells us.
It relates to this plane, this level, as much as higher levels.
Yeah.
It's a message from.
Would you
higher.
agree that in a situation like that, it cannot be put into words always? And that's why there is silence.
Thank you. We can't answer that. Yeah, we've been talking too much. Yeah.
Is the voice in the head any different from the voices that are spoken?
Is the voice in the head any different? Well, it depends which voice in the head, I suppose. Because we have we always have an inner dialogue with ourselves, don't we? During the day, I mean, everything we do is like it's like a conversation with one's two aspects, if you know. So that's a sort of like a conscious thing. But what I mean by hearing voices is where you get an external voice that talks to you and it says something to you.
How can we be sure that voice that we're having a dialogue with is not that voice?
Just through experience, I suppose, through knowing yourself. And I mean, that's a good question. We really have to know ourselves, and what can help is what correspondences do you feel at the time of hearing or getting these experiences? What do they relate to? Are they what feelings do you get that go with it? What colours do you get, or sounds, or what's the impressions? And through those correspondences, you should be able. An adept would always be able to discriminate. And the masters warn us that the favourite trick of elementaries or any other lower black magicians or whatever you want to call them is to impersonate the good. And unless you're an adept, it's very easy to be fooled by. We have people coming into the lodge who relate those things to us. They say, "Oh, a voice told me to do this, and I went and did it," and they get themselves into trouble. So
there was a message from Will Esmond.
Yeah. So there's one from.
And also something defined by Steve earlier.
Yeah. So Steve wrote, just an observation, it seems possible to summarise that if you read enough of the different writings about the Arthurian, is that how you pronounce it?
Arthurian legend.
The legend of Arthur in Britain. That perhaps this legend might be seen as a description of the movement from the Druidian impress upon the West and the effects of the West of Christianity, upon the West of Christianity. Yes, he's connecting the legend of Arthur, King Arthur, with the Druid wisdom and the effects of Christianity on it.
He defined something in the upper box. He scrolled up a bit.
That was yours.
Was that before?
Oh.
Satriarchal.
Oh, satriarchal is similar to patriarchal in the sense of a system of government ruled by men. Yeah. That was the Druids system, wasn't it? That was satriarchal. So Ambrose wrote, what is the occult rationale behind
cursus.
Cursus, I don't know that.
Or the course. It's the course.
Course of the propagation of the perennial wisdom from one place, one nation, one race to another. What causes this to happen, or is it just fortuitous? What drives the knowledge periodically from one civilization to another? And is there an unbroken link behind that? Why is it so important to understand that the unbroken perennial wisdom that runs through every race, civilization, and their periodical revival and or disappearance? And how is this related to man's own evolutionary history and its correlation to the evolution of the universe? Gosh, there's a lot of questions in there. Not sure.
I think we answered it earlier, but the cyclic evolution, the rise and fall of periods of darkness, periods of enlightenment, and so on. But also the stream moves from one location to another, or one region or nation to another.
I mean, at the beginning we had that slide that said that between 8,000 and 9,000 years ago there was a outflowing of information from Western China, or from China, Central Asia, that's right, the tablelands or the
Gobi Desert
lands, through India, and then all through Africa and Europe. And what Ambrose asked is there a unbroken link behind that? And it seems as though the unbroken link is in ancient India or Asia.
With the Aryan race, you mean? Coming into Europe.
Yeah. Well, with the Lodge of Masters, you see, because what Madame Blavatsky writes is that the Lodge of Masters was established right at the beginning, even pre-Atlantean times. Is that there's always been, humanity has never been left without its guardians. They may retreat and go up into the Himalayas and western China, but then maybe in the 2,000 years they then send out emissaries like the foundations of the Druzes.
Excuse me, Will. This little excerpt from chapter 4 from Krishna. O son of Bharatal, whenever there is a decline of virtue and an insurrection of vice and injustice in the world, and thus I incarnate from age to age for the preservation of the just, the destruction of the wicked, and the establishment of righteousness. Seems to say something to that. That on the one hand we are the receptors of this great wisdom, on the other the motive is very clearly to clear away the materialism that has drawn the truth, interestingly enough.
Thank you very much, Steve. Yes, that's very good, the chapter 4 of the Gita about the periodical outflowing of this ancient knowledge.
There's always injustice and vice.
Yeah, but sometimes it's worse than others, and then a special effort is made.
I mean, if you consider it personally, how we draw wisdom to ourselves, it's often through our suffering that we actually begin to pay attention.
Yes. So now there's just, well, you were going to talk about the correction that HPB made to Donnelly's work in Atlantis, the Diluvian World. Now she says in this article, the 17 Rayed Sun Disk, when Atlantis was in its prime, Europe did not exist as we know it, when Atlantis was in its prime. But nonetheless, there was free communication between Atlantis and some parts of Europe as did exist and Egypt. So there was communication during the Atlantean times between Europe and Egypt. Donnelly in Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, was partly given credit by HPB, as he was mistaken for calling Egypt an Atlantean colony. So what HPB is saying is that Egypt wasn't an Atlantean colony. Some people give the idea that Egypt came from Atlantis. So that's not right. And we should correct that, because that's what Donnelly wrote in the 1860s, and it still persists, that wrong idea.
But hold on, the pyramids were built by the Atlanteans, right?
It's supposed to be late Atlantean technology that built the pyramids.
And the Egyptians inherited them.
No, I'm not sure that is the case, actually. HPV doesn't say that the pyramids were Atlantean technology. I mean, I think that's part of the misconception. My understanding is that the Egyptians were the Indians were the first of the fifth root races. So we're in the fifth sub-race of the fifth root race. The Indians were the first sub-race. The Egyptians were the second. And the Greeks were the third. And I think it was the Egyptians who built their own pyramids. And they got their knowledge and wisdom from India, not from Atlantis. I think that's what HPV is trying to say. And she says, even though the wisdom religion of the initiates of Egypt was identical and hence showed similarities of symbolical sculpture to the Atlanteans. I mean, they all shared the same wisdom tradition, the same religion. But that doesn't mean to say that they got their that they were a colony of Atlantis. So that seems to be a popular misconception. It's still very, very popular today.
Can I ask a question? So the Vimayana we read about in the Vedantic text, is that a reference to the Atlantean technology?
Well, it's Indian as far as I understand. I mean, the technology may have existed in
the first root race.
Yes.
Of the area.
But the Atlanteans had tremendous technology, but presumably they passed it on to the Indians. Well, HPB says that. I mean, all the Atlantean knowledge was given to the fifth race before it degraded completely. Before the Atlanteans went down completely, they passed on their knowledge, and then they degraded. But by that time, all that knowledge was safely in the first sub-race of the fifth root race. Because the Atlanteans went down, in quite a bad way, premature way, through bad practices. But already all that learning seems to have been passed on. To some extent, actually, it wasn't completely passed on. So we've got just time for one more comment from Will. Interesting, Steve, that link between King Arthur's legend and the Druidic tradition. Merlin was presumably one of these characters. Yes, I'm not sure who Merlin was, but an initiate, certainly.
The sort of the ideal magician, but also a guide and guru of a king.
That's right.
But full of wisdom and quite an amazing character.
Well, I think in next week's article, in the one that we're taking up next week, it talks about the kings who were initiated and given healing powers. The ancient kings all used to be able to heal. You know, the laying on of hands. I mean, the kings were very advanced souls in those days, and they were able to cure people by touch.
You know, even in the movie Excalibur, the king is christened as the Lamb, and that when the concept of the connection between the king and the people was lost, then all of the great knights went to find what the king already knew was true. And these are intuitions, I'm trying to say. Certainly they formulated this into a fiction, but there's a beauty and power to it. You know.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah. Well, it's something Madame Blavatsky tells us to do, is to examine all our local legends. Yeah. And she says there's more occult truth in those legends than you could possibly imagine. I mean, the Grimm brothers did it with the German legends. They turned them into fairy tales. But there's lots of truth in those old legends.
A lot of modern movie directors do that.
Yes. Yeah.
Spielberg, probably.
I mean, they make they're timeless themes.
So every decade there's a new version
of
the story, famous story.
So let's just finish with a quote, a message from Ambrose. One thing that comes out is an understanding of universal brotherhood. Yes, that's very good. An understanding of universal brotherhood and the whole idea of unity and diversity of race, cultures, etc. An underlying unity. Yes, that's a very, very nice note to finish on, actually, because the whole intention of the ancient wisdom is for the benefit of all of mankind, all of humanity. It's our birthright. It's every nation's birthright, that ancient tradition, and it shouldn't be subverted and changed and made into dogmas and religion. It's a natural human knowledge of nature, and it's every person's birthright as a human being to have that, not to have dogmatic religion. And that unity among people is a natural feeling. I mean, if you have a child, children have no sense of, racial discrimination. They make friends with everybody. And it's natural in humanity, and what we then get conditioned into by society is unnatural. To say that some people are better than others, some people because they speak in a certain way, upper class or lower class, or all that's completely foreign to the natural sense of justice in the human soul. So as HPB said, the religion of the future is the religion of the ancients, and if it is anything like the true ancient wisdom, society will become wonderfully reformed, and it's going to take perhaps hundreds of years, but we can see it happening now in society. There are some good things happening. We're going through a very difficult time at the moment that's very traumatic for many people around the world. But there are some good signs of things that are going to come. And
a new flowering of the wisdom tradition, a new expression, but for the modern people, for the modern world. Just like it happened in Alexandria for a few centuries, the time of Hypatia.
The Neoplatonic movement, very good example.
And it fertilized the whole world. I mean, until it was repressed or
That's right.
pushed underground. But then it always appears somewhere else.
Okay, friends, so that's all. We've run over time by a long way. Thank you very much for your attendance and your comments and questions. So next week we've got the article that a lot of this has been drawn from the article we're going to study next week. But it's a very good article. There's much in the article that we haven't discussed tonight. So do come next Sunday, the 10th. The Origin of the Mysteries, article by Madame Blavatsky. And then on Saturday, the Saturday after that, on the 16th, we've got a seminar that we're going to examine the teachings of Krishna and Hermes. So one from the east, one from the west. And Patanjali and Pythagoras. And we're going to look at these ancient teachings and try and draw parallels between them. And because these are the philosophies that are going to come about in the next few hundred years. And they have to, really, because they're the truth. All of them contain wonderful knowledge of natural law and what man's future is. So all are welcome. Please tell your friends, especially for the seminar. It should be very interesting. And wish you all a safe journey home.